in this space, I'm going to talk about how ancient Indian sources talks about the Huns or how they describe these Huns. Now, before I talk about these Huns, first of all, let's look at the term Hūṇ. Hūṇ is the term which appears in the Sanskrit sources, and according to most scholars, this term Hūṇ is the Sanskritized version of Huns. And what we find is that if we look at other sources, for example, non-Indian sources, we find that in the Persian sources, there is this term Hyon. In the Roman sources, we have earlier Roman sources describe the Huns as Chionites, and then we have the term Hun itself being used for these Huns. And in the Armenian sources, you find the term Hon. So these are some of the terms that is used by non-Indian sources to describe these Huns. One question which appears is that what these Huns called themselves. So first of all, like most of the nomadic people, these Huns did not produce their own literature. And that is why we find that historians are not really sure about what these Huns called themselves. Now, interestingly, there are only two evidence or two reference in which the term Hun appears. Both of these two references are found in India. So the first important reference are the three ceilings that are found in Swat. And what we find is that here, now this is a ceiling, and there are three ceilings that were found from Swat, which is in the Indian subcontinent. And what we find is that in the legend is in the Bactrian language, and the script is Greek. And these three ceilings reads like, and I quote, "The Lord," and now the name of this Lord is missing. So historians cannot read the name of this Lord. So the Lord dash the king of the Oglar Huns, the great Kushan Shah of Sian of Samarkand. So this is the legend which appears on this ceiling. Now, this phrase Afsiyan of Samarkand was most likely, so Afsiyan most probably meant something like a ruler. So this seal belonged to a ruler of Samarkand. And according to scholars who have studied these ceilings, they argue that this term, this phrase Oglar Huns is possibly a clanic designation. And when we look at the seals and the title used, and also the use of Bactrian language, it suggests that this was a Kedrite king, or these three ceilings belonged to a Kedrite king. These three ceilings dates to around 450 to 460 AD. So this is the ceiling where the term Hun appears, or king of the Huns appear, and this is in Swat. Another reference comes from Kaushambi. Kaushambi is near Prayagraj, and here we have a clay seal impression, and here the term which is mentioned is Hūṇrāj. Now Hūṇrāj is now this is in Sanskrit, and those scholars who deal with the Huns presence in India, like Hans Baker, they argue that this is a spurious sealing, and that is because the inscription is not very readable, and it is also very hard for us to say this clay seal impression is. So that is why it is a spurious, or some scholars believe that this is a spurious inscription. But it is important to mention that there are only two evidence in which we can find Huns calling themselves Huns. And apart from this, interestingly, these two references or these two sources are found in the Indian subcontinent. And what we find is that other than these two sources or these two reference, there is no reference outside India or even in Indian subcontinent where the Huns are calling themselves Huns. So this is an important point. Now, there are some scholars who believe that the Chinese term Zhuangnu, something similar to this term, was used by the Huns to describe themselves. Now, it is another debate about whether the Zhuangnu were the Huns or not, and I will not go into this debate, but I do believe that they were Zhuangnu, the Huns were Zhuangnus. So coming back to our main topic, so let's have a brief overview of the timelines. So what we find is that around 350 AD, the Hunnic people are starting to settle in the region of Bactria. Bactria is the region north of the Hindu Kush mountain, which we today call Balkh. So here around 350 AD, the Hunnic people are settling. And what we find is that by around 388 AD, they have spread south of the Hindu Kush mountains, and the region of Gandhar has come under their control. We can say this because we have a great number of coins of the Hunnic ruler from the south of the Hindu Kush region. So the region of western Punjab and central Punjab has come under the control of the Huns. Now historians describe these Huns as Kedarite Huns, and Kedarite is the term which is derived from one of the kings of these Huns who was ruling both the territory north of the Hindu Kush and south of the Hindu Kush, and his name was Kedara. So what we see is that by around 388 AD, these Kedarite Huns have taken control of have occupied some parts of the Indian subcontinent. And from this point onwards, we find that up until the 7th century, these Huns will play an important role in Indian history. So this is a broad overview of the timeline which we are dealing with. Now, coming to how they are described in ancient Indian sources, there are two types of sources in which we find that Huns are mentioned. So the first are the literary sources. Literary sources are like texts. So text like Brihatsamhita or some Puranas. So these are the different literary sources in which we find that the Huns are mentioned. Then we have the inscriptional or epigraphical sources. So for example, we have inscriptions. Then there are coins which were issued by the Huns themselves. So we can use these epigraphical sources as well. But in this video, in this space, what I will do is that I will try to focus only on the literary sources. So when we analyze these literary sources, we find that there are two terms that appears. So the first is Har Hūṇa and the second is Shwet Hūṇa. And sometimes we have this variant where instead of Har, the term Hal is there, and instead of Shwet, the term Sita is there. So Har or Hal Hūṇa and Shwet or Sita Hūṇa. So these are the two types of Huns that are mentioned in Sanskrit sources. Now the earliest reference about these Huns or Hūṇa is in the Mahabharata, and particularly the second book of Mahabharata, which is called the Sabha Parvan or the book of the assembly hall. Now here what we find is that so this is the scene where different princes and tributaries of Yudhishthir are waiting outside the palace of Yudhishthir. So there is this whole passages where Duryodhan is talking about these princesses and tributary of Yudhishthir who were waiting outside his palace. So here we find that there are two description of the Huns. So first we have the term which is Hūṇa, and then we have the term Har Hūṇa. So let's see how these two terms are mentioned in Mahabharata. So we are particularly about the Har Hūṇa. So we are told that these Har Hūṇas were conquered by Nakula. So and the term Har Hūṇa again appears in the third book of Mahabharata, which is Van Parvan. So in Van Parvan also we have the mention of Har Hūṇa. Here they are mentioned with people living in Sindh. So Sindh is called Sandhava. Tukharistan, which is the region of Bactria, and it is called Tukhara, and China or China. So this is the term which is mentioned in Van Parvan. So Har Hūṇa are described living with these three groups. Now, interestingly, a somewhat similar term appears in Arthashastra also. So, in the second chapter of Arthashastra, Kautilya talks about two wine growing regions. And the first region is Harhur and the second is Kapishi. So Harhur, according to Hans Baker, Harhur is the region and Harhun is the people who live in the region of Harhur. And he believes that this was the region around the Suleiman Mountains. And because of this, he argues that these Harhunas were not Huns actually, because the description of these Harhunas appear in texts which dates back before the arrival of the Huns. So that is why it would be hard for us to argue that here the Harhuna is used to describe Huns. So this is the argument of Hans Baker, and I particularly agree with it. Now what we find is that when we move to a later text, so we have one of the main, important reference to Huns appear in Kalidasa's Raghuvamsh. And here what we find is that while describing the Digvijay of Raghu, Kalidas presents us with these details. So he talks about, Raghu is proceeding to conquer the land of the Parsikas. So these Parsika is the term which is used for Persians. Kalidas then goes on to tell us that in this expedition, Raghu encounters Yavana woman. According to Kalidas, Raghu could not bear the sight of the redness of wine on the face of the Yavana woman. Now Yavana, according to most scholars, here is used interchangeably with the Parsikas. So Persians or Parsikas are basically called Yavanas. So we should not think of the term Yavana here as describing the Greeks. Here it is used for the Persians. So after encountering the Yavana woman, Raghu then goes on and he then encounters the Western Yavana, who were strong with their cavalry. So cavalry is the strong arm of these Western Yavanas. And Kalidas then goes on to tell us that he won the battle and covered the ground with the bearded heads of these Yavanas. So this is the description which is mentioned. And after this battle, the soldiers of Raghu overcame their exhaustion by drinking wine. Now, after this, most important information for us, particularly about the description of the Huns, appear. So we are told that after defeating these Western Yavanas, Raghu then marches northward, and here the horse of Raghu's army relieved themselves of their exhaustion by rolling themselves on the banks of a river. Now, the name of this river is quite important because it will provide us the information of where the Huns are located when Kalidas is writing his Raghuvamsh. So, I will not discuss the name of the river yet. So, what is important is that, so this is the description when the Raghu's horses are rolling on the sands that were situated on the banks of a particular river. And after, rolling on the sand, we are told that these horses, shook off the saffron that was clinging on their manes. So these two important reference we have to keep in mind. So it will come later. And after that happened and this river was crossed, Raghu then fought with the Hūṇas. And the phrase which is used in Kalidasa Raghuvamsh is quite interesting. So Kalidas tells us that the Huns were made to feel the effect of Raghu's power, and the cheeks of their which is the wives of the Huns turned red at Raghu's exploits. So basically, Raghu defeated Huns. Then Kalidas goes on to tell us that Raghu then went on to defeat the Kambojas, whose country had an abundance of walnut. So these are the details which is present in Kalidasa's Raghuvamsh. Now, from this, particularly from these passages, one important thing which we can deduct is the fact that Kalidas is quite familiar with the practices of the Huns, and particularly this phrase that the cheeks of the wives of the Huns turned red at Raghu's exploit. So this frame is quite important because what we find is that there was this practice of the Hūṇa women where they used to cut their cheeks when their husband or their chiefs or their parents died. And what we find is that the later commentators, particularly who wrote commentaries on Raghuvamsh and other Indian sources also, they talk about this practice of how the Hūṇa women wept and they cut their cheek and their breasts. So this is an important description that is present in Indian sources. And if we talk about a later traveler, Huensang, now he also talks about a similar practice where he describes, and I quote, among some tribes, it apparently was the custom to tear or gash the face at the funeral of a parent or a chief. So this is the practice which was still prevalent at the time of Huensang. And even in the 4th century, a Roman writer, Ammianus Marcellinus, who talked about the Huns, so he uses the term Chionites for the Huns, and he talks about a similar practice which these Chionites practiced. So basically, the fact that a similar kind of mourning practice which was used by the female Huns. So this is what we find, that this was the practice of the Huns, and Kalidas is quite aware of this. So this is quite apparent from this description that Kalidas knew about the Huns. And when we talk about the location, so I have talked about this point about the river where the horses of Raghu rolled in the sand in order to relieve their exhaustion. So first, to find out the location of Huns when Kalidas is writing his Raghuvamsh, we have to first talk about the fact that in the initial passages we are told that when Raghu moved northwards to encounter the Parsikas, he saw the Yavana women whose faces were flushing with the redness of wine. So basically, Raghu's army passed from the region where wine was produced, and we all know that the region of Afghanistan and Western Gandhar was the place where wine was produced. So this is the region from where Raghu's army is passing, according to Kalidas. So after this, the description of river occurs, and Raghu has defeated the Western Yavanas, and after defeating the Western Yavanas, Raghu's horses relieved themselves of their exhaustion by rolling on the sand of a river. Now here, what is interesting is that the name of the river is quite critical for us to know about the location of the Huns, because after crossing this river, Raghu then fights with the Huns. And what we find is that in many of the manuscripts of Raghuvamsh, the river, the term which is mentioned when this whole phrase appears is Sindhu Tir. Sindhu Tir, we all know, means on the banks of river Sindhu, which is Indus. So some manuscripts tell us that the name of this river was Sindhu. But what we find is that in some manuscripts, we have the name Vangshu or Vanku. And one scholar who has studied the different manuscripts, and he found that out of the 9 manuscripts which he studied of Kalidas's Raghuvamsh, he finds that out of 9, 6 manuscript has the name Vangshu. Only 3 has the name Sindhu. So this suggests that Vangshu was most likely the river when Kalidas was writing. Now what we find is that even the old commentators who wrote commentaries on Kalidasa's Raghuvamsh, they also did not agree on which river Raghu crossed before fighting the Huns. So for example, we have a commentator called Mallinath who was from southern India. So he uses the term Sindhu Tir. So for him, it is the river Indus which Raghu crossed before fighting the Huns. But we have, commentators like Shir Swami and Vallabh who have given the name Vangshu and Vanku respectively. So even the commentators who wrote commentaries on Kalidasa's Raghuvams are not entirely clear about this whole problem of the name of the river. But in the text, if we take the view that it is the river Indus which Raghu crossed, then the passage does not make any sense. Because as we are told, Raghu, after defeating the Parsikas, went northwards. Now, we all know that, Parsika is for the Persians, and northwards of the region of Persia, there is no Sindhu there. So, if we take into account the whole passage and also the fact that out of the 9 manuscripts, 6 manuscripts has the name Vangshu or Vanku. So it suggests that this river which Raghu crossed before fighting the Huns was the river Oxus. So this makes it clear that when Kalidas was writing his Raghuvamsh, the Huns were in the region of Balkh or Bactria. So after crossing the river Oxus or Vangshu or Vanku, Raghu fought with the Huns. Now another important point, which buttress this argument is the phrase which is present in this whole passage is the mention of saffron. So we are told that after rolling on the sand, these horses shook off the saffron that was clinging on their manes. So saffron, we all know, was grown in Persia. So this also makes it clear that the river is Oxus, not Indus. Now, if we move to another text, which is a Puran, here we find that the location of the Huns has now changed. So in one passage of Vishnu Puran locates the Hūṇas within India and it places them between the Sauvira people of Sindh and the Salva people of Sakala. So between the region of Sindh and Sakala is the region of Sialkot or the surrounding area. So between Sindh and around Sialkot is the location of the Huns according to this passage of Vishnu Puran. So we can see that, from the reference of Kalidas. So in Kalidas's Raghuvamsh, he describes the Huns as living in the region of Bactria or Balkh. But by the time of when this particular phrase of Vishnu Puran was written, we find that now the Huns have moved eastwards and they are now described as living within the Indian subcontinent. This change in location is also there in a 6th century text. So this 6th century text is quite a popular text, and this is the Brihatsamhita of Varahamihir. And here what we also find is that there are two groups of the Huns that are mentioned. So first we have the Shweta Hūṇa and then we have the Hūṇa itself. So these are the two groups and they are described separately in Brihatsamhita. So when we talk about, the Shweta Hūṇa, so sometimes the term Shweta Hūṇa is used and sometimes the term Sita Hūṇa is also used. So these are mostly, according to most scholars, the same. These two terms are used for the same people. And here these Shweta Hūṇa are mentioned with the Pahlava, Desert Chinas, Afghan most likely was for the Afghans or the region of Afghan. So these are the people who are living on the borderland of the Indian subcontinent. So So based on this, we can argue that according to Brihatsamhita, which was composed in the middle of 6th century, these Shweta Hūṇa were living around the borderland of the Indian subcontinent. But what is interesting is that when Brihatsamhita talks about Hūṇa, here what we find is that these Hūṇa in Brihatsamhita are found together with the Malava, Paurava, Gandharas. So these groups, which are situated within India, so the Hūṇas are placed alongside these groups. So what is interesting is that in Brihatsamhita we have these two groups of Huns. So first is the Shweta Hūṇa or Sita Hūṇa, and the second is the Hūṇa. And what we find is that these Hūṇa are situated within India, so and most likely within the region of Punjab. And the second group of the Huns, which is called the Shweta Hūṇa, they are situated on the borderlands. And according to Hans Baker, this was the period when we find that the region of Gandhar, which is basically the region of western Punjab and central Punjab, are under the control of the Alkan Huns. And beyond the Hindu Kush mountains, it is the Hepthalite Huns who are ruling. So in Varahamir's Brihatsamhita, we have this clear differentiation between the Hepthalites, who are ruling the region of north of the Hindu Kush mountains, and the Alkan Huns, who are ruling the region of Gandhar or western and central Punjab. So the Hūṇas in Brihatsamhita are the Alkan Huns, and the Shweta Hūṇa in this text are the Hepthalites. Now what we also find is that if we move a century later, when Ban is writing his Harsh Charitra, we find that the Hūṇas are still there in this region. So what we find is that from the time of, let's say, Kalidasa, so we can clearly see this movement or the spread of the Huns in the literary sources also. So in when Kalidasa was writing, the Huns were situated in the region of Balogh. But by the time of Varahamihir, there is this two important differentiation between the two groups of the Huns that has occurred, and Varahamihir is also acknowledging this differentiation.